So, welcome to our forum discussion around voting for Biden. We're just going to go over and introduce everybody in order and see how this discussion is going to go. So, we're going to start with Alejandro. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Kashette. My name is Alejandro. I'm joining today from Ames, Iowa, and I'll be defending a position of class independence from the bourgeois parties in the tradition of revolutionary Marxism, which means not voting for Joe Biden.
Andre?
Hello, my name is Andre Salkin. I'm calling in from Boston, Massachusetts, and I will be siding with Alejandro in defense against Joe Biden. I believe in the use of voting as a short-term damage control tactic in certain scenarios to provide certain funding in certain small incremental ways for our communities that can really save lives. But I think leftists have to understand on a broader scale that electoral success will not be found in the bourgeois parties, and that we need to pursue real labor-based political organization in order to achieve political goals.
Ganapi, I'm calling in from Boston as well. And yeah, I'm a tiny bit split. I basically I agree with the fact that voting is part of the bourgeois system, but I also feel gaslighted by liberal rhetoric, and I'm not sure what's right.
Cool. Josh?
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm coming in from Ontario, Canada, and I'm arguing from a utilitarian position that while the democracy and the Democratic Party is not going to save us, there are material benefits to avoiding a second Trump term. So that would kind of de facto force you into voting for Biden.
All right, so I'm Keshet. Weird name. I'm foreign. The reason I'm moderating this discussion is because I'm not American, so I feel like I have a more neutral perspective and less bias. Mike, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mike. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm calling from Burlington, Vermont. I am anti-Biden, but I'm more along the lines of I'm arguing from the point of view that we should not vote shame and that we should kind of just respect whatever choice people choose to make, whether it's pro or anti-Biden.
Nat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nat, and I'm here to sort of defend the use of voting and its the use of it as a tool for the future of the left.
100%. Okay, I think that's actually a really good point to make before I bring up the first question, which is, maybe Josh, can you explain why you would support and you would choose individually to vote for Joe Biden?
So I want to draw a quick distinction between the word support and the word vote for. Biden's not my guy. Like I said, I'm Canadian. Joe Biden's to the right of even our conservatives here. We wouldn't support him making a run anywhere near me. But I do believe that he does, in the United States, pose the only real competition towards the second Trump term and the damage that Donald Trump poses when it comes to things like the Supreme Court, abortion rights, climate, COVID. There's a few examples of things that I feel the Republican Party and Trump in particular do more damage than Biden and the Democrats do. So it's purely a utilitarian thing. It's not so much like a moral support.
Ganapi, you mentioned how you feel like there is some pressure from liberals towards voting, and how does this affect you, and how does the rhetoric expressed by people like Josh affect you as an individual voter?
Yeah, so I think that, I agree with Andre. Voting can be used in a utilitarian way sometimes in very specific situations. But I feel like in this election, there is huge pressure to vote, pretty much no matter what, because the difference between Joe Biden and Trump is there, but not huge. And like it seems like every 4 years, every election cycle, like the difference between the Democratic and the Republican candidates are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And each time they're like, well, we'll hold the Democrat accountable. And and then we'll make the progress that we want to make under that Democratic president. But, we just have to get the Republican president out so that more people won't die. But, like, the thing is, people are still dying. And Joe Biden is not against defunding the police. His climate plan is the equivalent of spraying Febreze on a shit. And while I don't think he's fascist, like, he will not do anything to stop fascists, and like his policies basically like sort of enable fascists to keep going. So kind of this pressure to vote for him, I think, kind of erases all of those facts and also kind of ignores the fact that like our voting system isn't fair anyway. They keep saying like vote to save democracy. Well, democracy is already kind of crumbling and arguably already not there.
Well, I think, Alejandro, if you could expand on the fact that Ganapi made a mention of the word fascist when describing Biden and Trump, and it's also a word that is used often when people discuss saying Trump is a fascist, and to say vote Biden so as to save the American democracy. What would you say as a response to those statements?
So I would say, and I'm not responding directly to Ganapi. I don't believe that she holds this opinion, but I would say that the notion that this election between Trump and Biden is a decision between democracy and fascism is both an extremely pessimistic view on democracy and an extremely optimistic view on fascism. There is next to nothing about Trump that I can bring myself to call fascist, just considering the history of liberal democracy. To call Trump a fascist is essentially to give a clean pass to all of the horrors that have taken place under the liberal democracies, especially under the liberal democracy of the United States. Because it somehow says that everything up until Trump was better, somehow was fine, was cool, and that there can be a nice version of capitalism that isn't harmful, and therefore all of the harm under capitalism is ascribed to this sort of notion. We need to understand fascism as a very concrete and objective set of conditions that has a specific class basis to it, and simply calling the meanest version of capitalism you see fascism doesn't get us closer to doing that.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think, Nat, you can particularly speak on your own experience living under the liberal democracy in the United States, and how does the last 4 years under Trump make it feel like you are living in a democracy, or do you feel like it has been leaning towards fascism?
I mean, I think the United States has been leaning towards fascism for some time. I mean, historically, like Alejandro said, there have been atrocities that have taken place under different presidents, especially, I mean, Jim Crow era that was enforced. You have the internment camps set up by FDR. However, to say that, Donald Trump in the last 4 years hasn't been fascistic at all is completely reductive, and it's not true. I mean, this is a man who is extremely narcissistic and only does things because it emboldens him. This is the same man who wants his face on Mount Rushmore and will do everything he can. In the last 4 years, I mean, I live in California, so it's run by Democrats. However, what's been under attack is a woman's sanctity over her body. The repeal of the Obamacare which is horrible and doesn't go far enough, and is something that was set up under a Democrat Senate, a Democrat presidency, and a Democrat House. So there's so many things that have taken place in the last 4 years compared to a neoliberal standpoint. Donald Trump doesn't believe in climate change. Donald Trump is spewing rhetoric that migrants are rapists, are murderers, are filthy, that these other countries that are in the global south are shitholes, that they're shithole places. I mean, this rhetoric is hyper nationalistic. We live in a time where the president is disregarding an excess of 200,000 deaths. I mean, this is, I really don't care about fascism, but more so what the next 4 years with another Trump presidency, or what that will look like for the future of the United States. It's not safe, and if anybody on the left is cheering on another 4 years to Donald Trump, it's accelerationist, which is proven to be a sort of unrealistic approach to gaining a sort of foothold in the 21st century of socialism.
All right, so Andre, how would you distinguish this dichotomy that we've seen Alejandro and Nat discuss about fascism and liberal democracy, and how does that affect your vote directly?
Well, I think we have to all visualize this within the framework of capitalism, because Donald Trump, as a capitalist president, has not been at all an escalation of capitalism, more so than any other president has been. And for that reason, I think you still have to view all of this through a liberal democracy lens. And although Donald Trump does have some fascistic tendencies, I think what you talk about in regards to his narcissism really leads him more to like a loyalty-based ideology rather than an explicit ideology based on any kind of like national class interests, even though he kind of pegged at that in 2016. But I don't think he has explicit enough of an ideology to be a fascist. And I also don't think Joe Biden is a fascist. I think it's just the natural reaction of the liberal democracy state produce an incrementalist candidate that refuses to endorse even universal health care, which is an incredibly popular policy, as well as marijuana legalization. So I think it's an expected turnout from the liberal democracy state, as well as the alternative being a more nationalized liberal democracy state, but not necessarily one that I would call fascist.
Well, Mike, what do you think capitalism really does to the American democracy, and what role do you think capitalism holds in the American democracy?
I think capitalism plays a huge role in American democracy through, lobbying, campaign donations, etc. We saw that how corporate media treats candidates who threaten the interests of capital, like Bernie Sanders, even someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who's very anti-war, versus someone who does not threaten the interests of capital, like Joe Biden, who was kind of peddled as the electable candidate in the 2020 primaries, specifically because he didn't really threaten to fundamentally change anything in his own words. So I think that, when it comes to how capitalism influences electoral politics, I think it's I think more of how does capitalism not influence electoral politics, because it's the influence of capital on our democracy is extreme, and one might say that their interests are diametrically opposed: the interests of democracy and the interests of capital.
Could I jump in there for a quick second? So while I disagree with pretty much nothing that's been said pretty much for this entire discussion here, I think there's just a little bit of a misapplication of where the information kind of leads you to a conclusion. So while obviously capital influences democracy to like an abhorrent extent, like even in countries where they don't have like corporate donations or Citizens United, it's still a problem, and then the US just like blows that out of the water on top of that. Like, you want to talk thumb on the scale, this is like an elephant on the scale. So it's obviously a huge problem that needs to be addressed. However, I don't think that the solution to that is to cross your arms and say, I'm not going to participate, or I'm going to vote third party, or I'm going to write Nicki Minaj in as a write-in candidate or something like that. Because the outcome, the worst outcome from capital influence on a democracy is that your vote counts for nothing, right? That's like the worst possible outcome. But then if you don't vote, then your vote counts for nothing. So you're choosing actively the worst possible outcome as opposed to like a fudged outcome, let's say. So just if you want to talk like in a kind of a robotic mathematics kind of stats sense, it just doesn't track to throw your arms up and say, I'm not going to play your game because the rules aren't fair. Yes, the rules are definitely not fair, and that's a huge problem. But I don't think the solution is not to vote.
All right, Alejandro, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say that I think we need to establish that there's a difference, or that we're not talking about, that there's two different things between voting and not voting, and voting for the Democratic Party and not voting for the Democratic Party. Any healthy, any well thought out, any worthwhile political strategy on the left includes voting in bourgeois elections, because surprise, surprise, they actually do have an impact on, certain aspects of society, certain aspects of politics and of government. So the problem isn't, should we use electoralism as a strategy, or should we go try to find something else, and whatever that something else may be. But the question, specifically for me at least, is the question of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is prevented from, making any sort of meaningful progress that we actually need as, human beings, members of the working class, oppressed people, etc. Because politics isn't run by the ideas of, great men and things like that. That's not what drives society. What drives society are the objective needs of the systems of production and exchange that exist. The objective needs of capital, as capital, generates continuous and never-ending profit. And so I agree with a lot of what Josh says. Yeah, I think it's not really worthwhile to just kind of, vote for Nicki Minaj or something, even though a vote for Nicki Minaj would not be a vote poorly wasted. Where I'm going with this is we don't need to simply reject the ballot altogether. What we need is to be able to build a class-independent political structure of power that can run its candidates, that can participate in bourgeois elections, that can put forward a revolutionary transitional program, and actually be accountable to the mass rank and file of the working class, rather than the needs of capital. If we have that, then we should be voting in elections, right? There are countries that do have that. And of course, that's, subject to another discussion. But we absolutely should not be saying that, simply participating in a bourgeois election is a useless or a counter-revolutionary or so on and so forth measure. What we should be saying is that in order to meaningfully participate in the election, we need to be able to build a political infrastructure that can actually put forward our demands.
Well, Ganapi, what would you say is a form of political action that you would be taking aside from voting?
Yeah, aside from voting, the thing with voting is, like Mike, I'm not really here to tell anybody what to do, but I am here to tell people to not expect anything from the Democrats. If you feel like you need Biden in office instead of Trump, like, good for you, but I would not expect your life to be that much better when he's in office. So I think what would actually change the material conditions of American lives so much more than voting ever could at this point is, things like building community, mutual aid, protesting, basically sort of starting to build those structures that the government has chosen not to give us. There are no social programs, there's no support, schools don't teach us shit. It's kind of, doing what the Black Panthers did in the 1960s and 70s, and feeding our own people and, schooling our own people and making sure that we have protection. The Democratic Party and the government will not do that for us. So we have to take steps to do that for ourselves, which I think is so much more impactful than voting, especially since voting itself, it is pretty rigged in the United States. There's the Electoral College, depending on where you live, your vote will count much, much less, especially if you're a person of color. Yeah. I'm not going to go much farther than that because that's a different point.
Okay.
That's my response.
Well, actually, what I was going to do is I was going to ask Andre next, what are your thoughts on voting Green Party? Because of the fact that we've only spoken about voting Democrat or not voting Democrat, we haven't really considered a third option.
Yeah, so I actually interviewed Green Party vice presidential candidate Angela Walker with Mike a few months back. And I thought she was a fantastic candidate. She talked very specifically also about the Red-Green alliance that they had sort of undertaken, which recently meaning the Green Party had undertaken an explicitly socialist platform. And that was important to me because I would have voted for them if I did vote. I did not vote. I tried to, but I changed addresses and it didn't really work. And I didn't really care, to be honest, because I would have voted for Green Party either way. As for the 5% funding,
Can you explain about the 5% funding first?
Right. Okay, yeah, sure. So people, particularly on the left, have been defending the Green Party vote as something more than a protest vote, just kind of throwing it away. Because if the Green Party reaches 5%, I think, in certain states, or on a federal level, I'm not sure, honestly.
It's 5% nationwide.
Nationwide. It will receive federal funding. And so that's important, I suppose. But like Alejandro said, you really have to understand the material movers in society. And I think what will really be predicated, what the change in society will really be predicated on, it will not necessarily be that 5% funding. It will be real political organization, like what Canopy is talking about. That's super important. And building that mutual aid in communities and especially in workplaces will build sort of a political class consciousness that will naturally turn itself into electoral success for some kind of socialist option, I believe.
Well, Nat, you live in California, and that's typically a blue state. Would you say that Green Party is an option for you?
I mean, for me, it was an option. However, I'm not really as concerned with most leftists about a third-party option. I myself considered it, but I really don't think I don't think it's viable enough as a federal option, especially and outside of living in California. I think voting third party is fine. It might get funding for the area. However, I think when we talk about building political organizations and building upon power structures, Ganapi said something about what you can do besides voting. Protesting is something you can do and something people often do. However, it's much easier to protest under a neoliberal government than that of a fascistic one, or one that is, conservative. For example, I mean, when we have people protesting during Black Lives Matter, there were some places that were quite liberal and even quote unquote progressive that did make changes to the police management in the area. In Portland, for example. But you have places like San Diego, where I'm from, that actually made a $500 million boost in the police budget. And why did that happen? It's because we have people in the city council that are not only bought out, but people that are more conservative and don't have the ability to think more constructively and build upon the left. So I'd say what you do is you campaign and you push for progressive candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are at the federal level in the House of Representatives that are pushing for legislation to, increase not only the viability of third parties, but also get funding out of politics, and really push for the ability for people to run without having a wall in front of them, like a paywall in front of them. I don't know. I just think it's insane to think that voting Green Party in a toss-up state or a state where it's red is going to do much of anything. I mean, these are places where these are places where abortion rights are under attack, where LGBT people are constantly under threat, where there are these red states where sundown towns, or it's like, is it sundown towns? Yeah, places where it's quite dangerous for people of color, where they're literally murdered. But this extends to blue states too, where police are literally murdering black and brown people on the streets.
Mike, would you say there'd be much of a difference depending on the result of the election about these areas in the states? And do you have any rebuttal to Nat?
I think there's enough substantial evidence at this point to pretty much conclude that the Democrats would not be any better in government when it comes to defunding and or abolishing police. Joe Biden has staunchly defended law enforcement and has strongly condemned any sort of unrest that's occurred. He literally was quoted saying he'd shoot protesters in the leg and not the heart. He wants to give increased funding to police, and you can even go back to the Occupy Wall Street protests, which occurred under a completely blue Congress and executive branch, and it was largely the same. Habeas corpus was suspended. So I just think that at this point you can conclude that the Democrats are not going to stand with the people in the fight against police brutality and police injustice. And I just think that the idea of voting blue no matter who is kind of an idea that we have to really get rid of. Just because this election, this is my first election, but in the primaries, that energy was already happening. And I think that that's extremely dangerous, because I think people who are saying vote blue no matter who in the primaries are kind of admitting that they don't really care about, the material differences between the Democratic candidates. And it's more of just like a game for them. It's more of just like a comfort thing. A lot of liberals just wanted to get back to brunch and get Trump out of the White House, as the expression goes. So I think that just the idea of, vote blue no matter who is just a dangerous one. And I think that for all the reasons I said, it's very, very bad.
Ganapi, how would you feel when you hear people talking about, get back to brunch or vote blue no matter who? From your individual perspective and life experience, does that make you feel a certain way?
Yeah, I've noticed, I think ever since 2016 when Trump is in the White House, much of the outrage over Trump has been very surface level things. It seems that liberals are much more concerned with the fact that Trump is rude rather than sort of any of his policies. And yeah, to sort of pile on a little bit to the awful things that have happened under Democratic leaders, migrants started being imprisoned at the border over Obama, he deported people at record rates. Standing Rock happened under Obama, all of that stuff. And, we're talking about, the stakes of the next election being abortion rights and Black Lives Matter or whatever. But the thing is, since this United States is, what's it called? Is such under a federal system, who is in the White House, at the top, doesn't necessarily have power over what the individual states are trying to do. Roe v. Wade has not been overturned yet, and yet a whole bunch of southern states only have one abortion clinic because they're stretching the undue burden clause to its absolute limit. Black people are already being shot in the streets and there are no consequences. All of the things that people are scared of happening under another Trump presidency have already were on track to happen under Democrats and will continue to happen under Democrats. And basically, if we're thinking about our overall goal here, which is to have a just society, whatever that means, I'm just kind of wondering what we have to do, because I saw this W.E.B. Du Bois quote the other day. He pronounces it Du Bois. And basically he was saying that the two parties were the same evil with different faces. 100 entire years ago, and we're still playing with that system, and we're still asking the same questions. So how do we get out of this? And my concern with voting is that is it playing into the system? And is there any way to get liberation if we just don't reject it altogether?
Well, talking about the liberation, Alejandro, what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I agree with the points that Ganapi is making, that simply the federal government, not even the federal government, but the leader of the federal government is not what indicates the actual progress being made on all of these issues. I am coming here from a swing state, from Iowa, a state that gets a lot of attention during the election. I'm from sort of a soft blue town, a college town, but it's in the most conservative district in the state. For reference, my congressman is Steve King. But Natalie brought up a point that in these states like mine and others like it, the rights of women, of LGBT people, of people of color, of immigrants, all of these things are constantly under attack. And I think that is what I would like to highlight, that they are constantly under attack, and they have been constantly under attack for as long as there have been swing states and red states. And the way out of that isn't by simply perpetuating the system, right? Iowa voted for Obama twice. That didn't change the fact that during his term, we were constantly fighting attacks on women's rights, on abortion rights, on immigrant rights. Our congressman is easily the most anti-immigrant person in that building, and that was not changed by the fact that Obama was president. Certainly, didn't matter much to him who was president. The point being that we cannot escape these issues by voting for Democrats, because the Democrats in these states have never cared to step up against these issues, and the Democrats in any of the states really haven't, right? You mentioned AOC and praised things that she's doing to try to open up the playing field and things like that. But that doesn't change the fact that she's voting for Donald Trump's war budgets, right? She's perpetuating all of the things that we need to be destroying. And the problem isn't that AOC is a bad person or that she's, some this or that. The problem is that as a member of the bourgeois party, as a member of the Democratic Party, she has to take these positions. She has to continuously slide to the right if she wants to continue being a congressman. Because if she were to just continue to defy, if she were to stop towing this line so carefully, they would just put someone else against her, and they would fund this person's campaign endlessly, and she would lose her seat in a heartbeat. That's why we need a third party, because the AOCs, the Ilhan Omars, the Bernie Sanderses of this country are held back from not just saying what they mean, but more importantly, actually helping working people and oppressed people by the fact that they continue to choose working in this Democratic Party machinery. And frankly, a mass working class party, a labor party, is not going to be a revolutionary socialist party from day one. That's something that's a separate battle that will have to be fought after its founding. It's going to be full of the AOCs of this country. But what that allows us to do is actually be able to platform issues that are important for the working class without them simply being watered down by the Democratic Party, without having these politicians turn into scapegoats so that the Democratic establishment can attack them every single fucking day, trying to side with the Republicans in this great debate that they're always having with each other over who's more conservative. I don't dislike AOC at all, even though I will every day attack her for voting for things that kill people. But the problem is that she has chosen to work within a machinery that is completely antithetical to what she claims to support, and can never allow her voice and her set of political ideas to win the day. It won't. They will side with Donald Trump before they ever side with her.
All right. Thank you very much, Alejandro. I think that was very well said. But I would imagine that Josh would have quite a lot to.
Yeah, there
disagree.
was. Yeah, so there's a lot. There's a lot that was said between Mike Gonapi and Alejandro here, and I don't disagree with most of it. I think what the core disagreement comes down to here, and I really, really hate to play this card, but it comes up a lot when I talk to a lot of really young, really left people. There is a difference between being correct and being effective. And there tends to be a vast overestimation of our numbers and our influence. Like, yes, I can go on leftist Twitter and it's like, wow, the revolution's happening now. There's all these people who want to smash stuff. But like, go outside, man. Go knock door to door. Go canvass for like a Bernie Sanders type in like a purple area, and people will laugh at you for like shit that a Canadian would consider conservative, right? It's a defeatist kind of, not attitude, because you sound quite optimistic, but it's a defeatist implementation to reject the closest thing we have to influence in favor of something that we just straight up don't even have. Like when Howie Hawkins tweeted at AOC that like she stole my Green New Deal and like ripped out the good parts and now it's like a shell of its former self and all that. I don't even deny that. That's probably correct. I don't really care if it's correct or not. The difference being Howie Hawkins has never held public office, at least not at a federal level, and I don't think anywhere. So like, while he may be a chill dude, you can be a chill dude in your basement all day long. Good luck getting anything passed, right? Like, if you want to talk to Bernie Sanders, everybody loves Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders knows how to play the game, right? And he moved millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people to the left. He destigmatized, to the extent that one person can, the term socialist, democratic socialist. We can argue about how correct he is in labeling himself that, but whatever. The idea being that there is an amount of sucking it up and playing the game in the meantime, whilst you build the tools through which you actually accomplish what it is.
Thank you very much, Josh. I really appreciate your different perspective. But my main question would be to Ganapi. How did you feel about Josh saying that you people gotta get out and actually look at the world, meet people? Do you feel like you have been getting out sufficiently in order to understand what the political field truly is like? Or do you feel like maybe you have been sitting on Twitter for a bit too long? As Josh said.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I'm personally not on Twitter a ton. No, I think I have like a realistic like, my thing is, I am like sort of the view that like I do have very few allies in this world, and that I do have allies, but they're not a lot. But like the thing is, like, I know that white people vastly vote in their own interests, and their own interests are almost always racist, patriarchal, capitalist, and in a country that still has majority white people, I do not expect there to be majority white people and there's still a lot of class differences and all that stuff. I do not expect there to be like a sort of like mass cultural socialist revolution anytime soon. Like, my thing is, like, is it possible to have any influence that benefits people of color and poor people and women while playing in their system? I'm sort of the thought, we're wasting time playing around in their system that is only benefiting them, and we should start building up our own coalitions and sort of distributing resources among ourselves and actually supporting each other and kind of like rejecting the individualism that the United States has taught us to hold.
Josh, how did you feel when?
Am I?
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think
am
Matt
I able
wants to
to
jump in here.
There's a lot of points that are a lot of loaded points that I think need to be broken down a little bit. I mean, first of all, Alejandro was talking about AOC and how She's silent and unable to say the things that she wants. But you go on Twitter any day of the week, she's not silenced at all. She's saying what she wants. If anything, you got old boomer Jim who lives in fucking Lib City, sitting here rooting for a progressive who wants like socialized medicine, and he's sitting here like, rooting for Joe Biden. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the future of the Democratic Party. I mean, and to say that, if she wasn't able to speak her mind, or if she wasn't voting, for Trump's budgets, I'd like to see like these votes. I'd like to see it, and if Alejandro's right, fantastic. I'm glad to trust him. But I mean, to say that she's becoming more and more conservative, it's bullshit. It's bullshit to say that people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib aren't pushing for socialism in this country, for worker co-ops, for people to break the mold of employer and employee. And Ganapi was saying that white people often vote in their interest, which is true. They do vote in favor of people that do keep in the status quo of capitalism, which is inherently racist due to the way in which capitalism has, over time built itself up from colonialism, from systemic racism. But to say that they vote in their best interest all the time is completely incorrect. I mean, they vote. A lot of white people vote for Republicans, which are, hyper-capitalistic, and white people often vote for neoliberals, who are also capitalists. That, while people are getting tax cuts, I mean, the rich are sucking us dry of profit. I mean, if we want to talk about building coalitions, these coalitions are here. They're being made. They're being pushed. But people are sitting here picking on people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We're doing the work. I don't even give a shit about AOC. It could be anybody else. All right. But we have to get involved in local politics, and it's just frustrating to hear that, nothing's being done, or that, there's nobody in the Democratic Party that has anybody's interests in mind. I mean, that's bullshit. I mean, there are people that, if you want to see these people in power, you do your very best in primaries. But at the end of the day, if they're not elected in the primary, if somebody else is pushed and elected, then that's something we can learn from and work towards the next time.
But now,
if you disagree, you go out into the streets, you protest. But if you're protesting a fascist, they're only going to shoot you and tear gas you like the neoliberals do when you're protesting things like Black Lives Matter.
You say that AOC is the future of the Democratic Party. Mike, Can you tell me, do you believe that's true? And do you believe that your future as an American citizen is also in the Democratic Party?
I would say no and no. To AOC, like, I like AOC. I'm a fan of AOC. Like, she's working within a capitalist party. So, there's a limit to what she can do and what she can vote for. But I don't think that she's the future of the party. Precisely, I think we can look at the Lincoln Project as a great example of what the future of the Democratic Party is. The Lincoln Project is basically just a coalition of Bush-era Republicans, Obama-era Republicans who just don't like Trump. And so they're basically, because they see that Joe Biden's agenda is really no different from any textbook Republican agenda, maybe with a little twinge of like progressive politics because of like all like the like, what do they call them? Like the coalitions that they have, like the climate coalitions or whatever. And I mean, look at, like, they had John Kasich, who like voted against abortion rights when he was the governor of Ohio, speaking at the convention at the DNC. So I think it's obvious that, especially considering how much capital Lincoln Project's acquired, they got a ton of money through donations. They're already expanding. That's the future of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a center-right party, and people like the Squad they're just not welcome. They're the outsiders, and so I think that.
Who do you refer to?
Have a little more,
Mike.
Well, I mean, it's expanded since its original iteration, but I think the original iteration is AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley, right? And then now it's going to have like Cori Bush and like probably Jamal Bowman and the other guy from New York. What's his name? Jones, right? So, yeah, I do not think that the future of the Democratic Party is a social democratic agenda. I think it's quite the opposite, actually. I think because the GOP is moving right, the Democratic Party can move right along with it and get away with it. And I think we're already seeing that in real time.
Well,
And I guess to the I just had one more thing, if that's cool. It was
Yeah,
just like
go ahead.
something that's related. So like to Josh's point, like I try to like go outside and like talk to like friends. And I'm from a suburb. Like I just talk, and like most like people that I talk to, like kids that I talk to about politics, friends are just like people that I meet or whatever. They mostly like they respect me more because I don't support the Democratic Party, because they recognize that the Democratic Party is a bad party. It's a flawed party, and so I think that tactically, actually, by alienating ourselves from the Democratic Party, I think we can actually be more appealing to like disenfranchised, voluntarily disenfranchised, like white people who really like are like centrists or just like don't give a shit about politics. I think that if we distance ourselves from the other two, I think that that would actually be better tactically
Ganapi,
in the long run. I think we should start.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike.
Can I respond? Can I respond?
I think we're gonna have Ganapi respond, and then you can go now.
Yeah, to clarify my point in a tiny bit more detail, white people vote in their self-interest to place themselves in a position above people of color. So through like various forms of propaganda that I won't go into right now because I'm trying to keep this short, it can convince white people to vote against their own self-interest, but they don't see that. I was watching a video the other day of like some more news, and he was saying statistics that white people will be generally for safety net programs like food stamps and free housing, whatever, but if they perceive those different services to be going towards people of color, they will start being against it. Like they're white people, like especially a lot of poor working class white people, see themselves in opposition to people of color and think that they're fighting for the same piece of pie. So if they perceive something as going towards people of color, then they will vote against it, even if it hurts themselves, because it is in their own race self-interest.
I think that's a very interesting point, Ganapi. And Nat, what would you say to that?
I really don't have a response to the Ganapi because I do think she's correct. White people oftentimes, I mean, when a social program is proposed, they're like, oh yeah, this is great, fine. But as soon as it is tied to the people of color, it's often, you know, looked down upon as like a grab out, a handout, socialism, bogeymans like that. So I agree, Ganapi, you bring up an amazing point. But I think to respond to what Mike is saying, I mean, when you go out and talk to these people and they respect you more for not supporting Democrats, it sounds like posturing. It sounds like an emotional. I mean, all this just sounds emotional.
What do you mean by
really to say
Nat,
that? To say.
Nat, can you expand on what you mean when you say posturing?
When I talk about posturing, there's a lot of leftists who, online or in their social circles, will often feel like, I'm doing this as a Marxist. Or I'm not voting for Joe Biden because I'm a good Marxist, or I'm voting Green Party because I want to see an alternative in the voting system as a socialist, or something like that. But when we're saying that the Dems are shifting more to the as Republicans do, we have to ask ourselves, why are Republicans shifting right? It's because fascists are being emboldened. When we have somebody like Trump in office, fascists are emboldened to go out and vote for fascists. I mean, it only makes sense that liberals are going to join forces with fascists, and historically this pans out. I mean, even Trotsky has written about how you have, and I think using the word Stalinist is reductive, but I mean, Stalinists would call FDR a fascist. Stalinists would call the socialist candidate at the time a social fascist. So to say that, you know, the solution is it's pointless to say that we should look for alternatives at the federal level, when at the federal level we have somebody who has the power to appoint judges like Donald Trump has. He's appointed conservative judges. He's packed the court. these are material outcomes, and if you guys want to call yourself Marxists, you have to look at the results of a conservative presidency, and compare that to a neoliberal. And in all honesty, you have to ask yourself: would you rather live under a conservative presidency or a neoliberal where people are going onto the streets, they're protesting for a reason? It's not going to go away under a Joe Biden things like climate change and all that are not going to go away under a Joe Biden president, and that's why you go out to the streets. That's why you go out and pressure people for their life. That's what it did to FDR. FDR didn't give a shit about the people. FDR was in office, but he was pressured to put forth a New Deal after the Great Depression.
Okay.
So,
well, I think
what's the solution? What's the solution?
I'm sorry to cut you short. We are running out of time over here, but you make reference to basically a sort of revolution versus reform kind of argument. Mike, can you give us 2 minutes on what you think about what Nat said, and specifically in the context of reform versus revolution?
I mean, I considered voting for Biden. I'm in a deep blue state, so for me, it just made sense to vote for the Green Party. I just felt like with the Electoral College, I might as well put my vote towards something productive, like maybe getting the Green Party funding. So I mean, that's where I'm coming from in terms of why I voted Green. Like I don't begrudge you for voting Biden. Like I agree, but I also think that like Biden was known when he was a senator to like support and help appoint conservative judges to the Supreme Court. He literally said about Amy Coney Barrett, like she doesn't seem like too bad of a person or something like that at the first debate. So she seems like a fine person, I believe the quote was. So like I guess I agree. Like I think that fighting fascism or fighting neoliberalism under Biden would be kind of easier because he's weaker. But I also think that we also have to remember the reality that the Obama era kind of brought us Trump, because Obama promised real material change and didn't deliver. And so Donald Trump being like, he actually, he ran on bringing troops home from the war. He ran on improving our healthcare system. So I think I think the very real reality that we do have to remember is that if Joe Biden is elected president, the chance, it's almost a foregone conclusion that the 2024 GOP candidate is going to be worse than Trump and is going to be even more on the extreme scale of, much more, even more fascistic, I guess.
All right.
So I don't know. I
think I'm gonna actually toss this over to someone who's knows quite a lot about this specifically, and I think Nat made an interesting reference to historical events, particularly with the writings of Trotsky when talking about liberal leaders at that time. What do you think about the point that Nat made, Alejandro?
Yeah, no, I agree with that point, I think. And I think it makes a lot of sense. But I don't think that it ends up backing what Nat wants it to be backing up. Because specifically, I don't think that we're dealing with a question of fascism versus, non-fascism or democracy. I simply believe that we're dealing with the more conservative layer of the ruling class and the slightly more liberal layer of the ruling class. And the only way out is to reject both of those in favor of the actual power of the working class, the actual rule of the working class. The Democratic Party isn't just this neutral shell that can be occupied by any, form that it happens to be occupied by, because, again, history, society, politics are not driven by ideology. They're not driven by the ideas of people. They're driven by the material conditions and the objective motors of society, which are the relationships of production and exchange. The material basis of the Democratic Party is that of the bourgeois. The Democratic Party exists day to day. It gets its funding, its entire existence as an entity is ensured by the fact that roughly half of the American ruling class supports them and gives them money. That's not something that we can work in, right? Because we would be going fundamentally against the thing that allows the Democratic Party to exist. The only way that we could occupy the Democratic Party is if we already destroyed it in the first place. And that seems like twice the work than simply building a workers' party. The question of social fascism in history, and the question of what Trotsky defined as fascism, which I think is extremely important, because again, Trotsky's definition of fascism is not an ideological one. Trotsky's definition of fascism is a specific set of class relationships. Trotsky defines fascism as a response from the ruling class to a successful left-wing movement, right? When you can't just shut down protests by liberal democracy, sending out a couple riot cops and battering people around, you have to fundamentally change the way that your government is structured, and base your government atop, violent paramilitary, essentially, organizations that crush the movement of the working class. The only way we can actually defeat fascism, the only way that we can fight against that, because that is something that we'll be staring down as events go further, but the way that we beat fascism is to win. The way that we beat fascism is to win so hard that even the strongest reaction that the ruling class can have can't defeat us. And we are fully capable of doing that, right? We are in the most advanced capitalist country to exist. And what that means in one of the most important dimensions is that we're in the country that has, quite simply, the largest percentage of its population as members of the working class, right? We're 90% of the United States. And obviously, we're very far from having the full support of the working class, but we have a lot of evidence that we can glean that the working class doesn't want us to tell them to vote for Joe Biden. The working class obviously doesn't want to vote for Joe Biden. That's a given. But the working class, what the working class of this country likes is the burning of the police precinct in Minneapolis. 57% of Americans supported that. What the working class wants is an independent political party. Roughly 2/3 support among Americans say that neither of the parties represent their interests, and that's true. And I think that all of us agree on that. I'm not trying to say that anyone here is saying that the Democratic Party fundamentally supports its interests, but what I'm saying is that we don't need to cling on to these ideas of like the Overton window or something as sources from which we derive power. I would say that those are things that prevent us from holding real social power, because people don't want us to just sit with the most progressive members of the Democratic Party, because they don't give a shit, because at the end of the day, AOC becomes subservient to the powers of the Democratic Party, regardless of the fact that, yeah, she is a person who has good ideas, who certainly has a good moral compass, and wants to see the kind of change that many of us could abstractly say that we want to see. But the way that we can actually, make these changes, the way that we can actually bring in support from people who are members of the working class rather than support from, people who are Democrats or Republicans or whatever, is by viewing them as the working class and building an organization that is actually for them as workers rather than Republicans or Democrats or independents or what have you.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. I think that was very eloquently put. But I'm going to actually toss this over to Josh to conclude, because we are running out of time.
So while I appreciate that the caveat of not accusing any of us of like actually liking or thinking the Democrats are our party, because 100% that's not the case. Every time I have this conversation with people, it devolves almost immediately into like a PhD thesis on like an 80-year plan on how you're going to overthrow the United States government by building dual power, and you start quoting Lenin and Trotsky, and I'm like, whoa, dude, the election's in 2 days. I'm talking about like immediately what you're going to do now, as people don't like using the term harm reduction because it's got other connotations that it started with, but whatever. Damage control. You want to talk abortion rights, Ganapi touched on it, where the current state, while we have Roe v. Wade, you might have a state that only has one abortion clinic in it. Well, I would rather have one abortion clinic in a state like Georgia or Alabama than 0. And anyone who's going to argue with me that 0 is somehow better than 1, I think has gone completely off the rails. So if you agree that one abortion clinic is better than 0 in Georgia, then you're going to want to keep conservatives and the Republican Party out of power as much as you can. And the only realistic way to do that in this election, I'm not talking about 60 years from now when you've built a workers' party and done all this work. Right now, the only way to do that is to vote for Joe Biden. Obviously, if you're in a blue state, you can vote green. There's a bunch of other arguments. But I'm talking like a swing state when you can affect who's going to be in charge. There's a demonstrable difference between the two, between what is effectively a bad candidate and a worse candidate. And with the election in whenever this goes live, like 2 days from when this goes live, you kind of have to stick to like the action right in front of you, and then go on to do all of the other things that you've talked about, which I don't disagree with like any of.
All right, thank you, Josh. So I think that was a really good way to end off. But we're just gonna finish with a final little segment. Mike, you can say what you want to say, and then we're gonna just do our final little segment.
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, like I'm not like gonna. I think that's sound reasoning to vote for Biden. I'm cool with it. I just think that I'm wondering if we should like. I think as leftists, I think as soon as this election's over, this is me personally. I'm just wondering what everyone else thinks. I think after this, we have to just permanently sever ties with the party. That's my personal opinion. I think if we have to do it immediately after, I think from that point on, I think we have 4 years to build a coalition for the next president. I think that every person who wants to see an actual candidate that represents their interests the next time around, I think the work starts immediately after this election. So that's kind of where I stand. I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Vote Biden and then protest and shit all over Biden. Easy peasy. Get the bad candidate into office because it's better than the worst candidate, and then continue on with your pushing. Either you're pushing him to whatever policies that you think you might be able to get away with, or you're building another party entirely and then just being able to say fuck the Democrats. I think it's a little bit optimistic to think that you could build a party from the ground up to like relevancy in 4 years, but I mean that's an admirable position, and I would not be against that. But that's really, I think, most of what we're doing here is not disagreeing on a whole lot, which makes it a little bit confusing that we arrive at such different conclusions. But it's mostly comes down to the election's in 2 days. What's your immediate action? And then after that point, I think we become in agreement on just about everything, actually.
All right. Yeah, I think that's a good place to end off. What I want to finish with is we're just going to go around in reverse order and see what do we think everybody's predictions are for these elections. So we're going to go with Nat first. Who do you think is going to win?
I think by every metric, it shows, the polls show, even in one conservative polling, it shows that Trump might win by like 3 points, but the chances of that happening are so slim. And even if you take the polls and completely and Trump outperforms the polls, Joe Biden still is still ahead, and even some of these swing states, not swing states, but even some of these were likely voters.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, I think Trump could feel it when it comes to the Supreme Court. And what could happen there, I'm not sure. There are actual fascists out there and actual paramilitary. Right. I mean, with great Meal Team 6. Meal Team 6 is out there, buddy.
Out there. Got it. Mike, who do you think is going to win?
I think mail-in voting really kind of determines this. I think I saw a stat that over half the country's already voted early. So I think it depends on how successfully Trump can suppress that vote and just the vote period. But I'm thinking Biden, just because I think everybody who doesn't like Trump is voting. They're throwing in the towel. So I think it's going to be Biden, but I would not be surprised if Trump pulled it off. So.
Okay. Well, Josh, you're not American, but I'm still interested to hear what's your prediction.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of laugh at 538 because of all the predictions for Clinton, and then obviously it went the other way, but that's just kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of stats. Unlikely things can still happen, they're just less likely to happen. We're looking at, like Mike said, over 50%. I think in comparison to 2016 votes, it's like closer to 65 or 70 already. It's absolutely insane turnout. You guys are looking at the highest turnout that you've seen since like 1908, and like high turnout like that really favors Dems because Republican numbers don't tend to shift all that much. The Dems tend to be the ones that are, or I say Dems, blue voters. American left, let's call them voters, tend to be the ones that are like disenfranchised and apathetic and whatever, right? Or maybe they're people of color and they're institutionally disenfranchised. But yeah, the voter turnout numbers and the polls look like an absolute devastation unless Trump can pull and some absolute crazy shenanigans out of declaring victory on election night, and then throwing a bunch of stuff through the Supreme Court. And even if they go for him, like, it would take a lot. He could do it, but I don't foresee it happening. I think it's got to be Biden. It looks pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, well, it looks overwhelming, but still, as you say, Trump might stay in power. What do you think, Ganapi? And do you think that Trump would pull something crazy?
I don't think it's like outside of the scope of reality for Trump to pull something crazy. And like, we have to remember, like, the Electoral College has delegates in it. Like, there are a lot of states where like the delegates don't have to choose like who the voters picked to vote for president. So, you know, I know like a lot of those people, so there's that factor. And there's also like the mix-up of the ballots and the mail-in voting. And the Supreme Court just said that like you can't count ballots that come in after Election Day. And all of that stuff. And yeah, address the 538 thing, but like, I'm still scared about the 538 thing. There was no chance that Trump was going to win in 2016, and guess what? He did. And some really weird electoral stuff can happen. Like, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but she lost the electoral. So even if there is, you know, technically more votes for Joe Biden, he could still lose legally under our system. And, you know, that's not accounting for the fact that Donald Trump might not respect the numbers anyhow.
All right. Thank you very much, Ganapi. That is actually interesting when you compare it to 2016, with Hillary getting the majority popular vote. What role do you think delegates are going to have in the 2020 elections? And do you think it'll be a similar story to 2016? Andre?
I think it's potential that delegates could have a huge role in elections, particularly in battleground states. But I think Joe Biden is slightly edging Trump out at this current moment. And I don't see any action on behalf of Trump that would suggest that he could really turn it around electorally at this point. So I'm predicting Trump will lose. And that's mostly due to my assessment of like the material factors in the country. We're currently going through a recession due to coronavirus. Trump has handled it awfully. And also now, as compared to 2016, like you were talking about, Trump isn't appealing to really working people's material concerns anymore. I think in 2016, there was this great odor of people called him like a right-wing populist. If you're watching Trump's campaign at this point, it's not even populist in nature whatsoever. And he's completely abandoned any kind of working class rhetoric in favor of now looking for like the Trump loyalty and the name. And it's more of an ethos now rather than an ideology. So I think that's why Trump will lose this time.
That's great. I think I actually really agree with you, Andre. Unfortunately, we cannot ask Alejandro because he's experienced some technical issues, and Josh's facts and logic just shut his computer down. So that happens. So I think thank you everybody very much for speaking so well. We're going to conclude it here, and yeah.